This week, all bets were off when it came to the GGs.
It's a struggle, especially in the smaller yards. We're really sort of noticing the hit. I mean, the owners, they're coming to us every day and saying, why are we committing to this? Why are we paying this money every month to keep our horses in training? And there's nothing coming back to them.
Sarah Guest, yard manager at John O'Shea Racing, speaking to Sky News on Tuesday. Jamie, what's the story?
Yes, this week, Wednesday. Does that work? Yeah. This Wednesday that just happened.
Yes.
Everyone listening will remember.
We know how the 7-day structure works. Yeah.
Yeah. It was the Wednesday that you've just had. There was no British horse racing. Meetings at Carlisle, Kempton and Lingfield were cancelled, and as well as others around the country, as jockeys, trainers, racehorses and bookmakers united in protest at... Well, it's actually, to be honest, it's basically just the fact that the Treasury are considering raising the tax on horse racing. This hasn't even happened yet, but they went on strike. It's the first time that British horse racing has ever gone on strike. There was some reportage about it, but it was a big deal, and I think does highlight quite how culturally important British horse racing is, given the effect that it had and the number of MPs that were asked about it. To explain, basically, at the moment, bets from horse racing, it's taxed at 15%, which is lower than other forms of gambling, which is roughly around 21%. The Treasury is considering, because as we know, we're at a time when the Treasury needs some money, is considering basically harmonising what it calls remote gambling duties. So all betting would be around 21%. This has obviously upset the bookmakers, but it's also upset those involved in horse racing. And now that's because basically bookies fund a lot of horse racing. One, through this thing called the British Horse Racing Levy, which is basically a tax on the profits of bookmakers with regards to horse racing that then goes back into the sport. And it was introduced in 1961 because you were basically in 1961 allowed to bet and not attend horse racing. Previous to that, you had to be at the event in order to bet. Yeah. But now you're allowed, obviously, as we know, we can bet from wherever we are in the UK on horse racing.
Well, that's the importance of the word remote in the proposed legislation, though, isn't it? It doesn't actually affect, as I understand it, still traditional bookmakers. Because that's where your natural sympathy might be, fair enough, if you're standing there by the horse track and the government want to take more tax off you for the first time in decades. But it doesn't affect those guys. It's just for people in gambling shops and online. Yeah,
exactly. But they don't have to pay. Your bookmakers at the events don't have to pay any tax at all, which I didn't realise.
Wow.
So until reading about this. So no, it doesn't. I think the problem is that they know that people are betting much more from at home, from the comfort of wherever, despite the fact that horse racing is actually the second most spectated sport in the UK after football. The British Horse Racing Authority has commissioned analysis which says that it will be about a £330 million revenue hit over 5 years, and that places nearly 3,000 jobs at risk. The government line at the moment is that they haven't made any decisions, that basically simpler and unified tax would be cleaner and a better way of revenue raising. And they highlight, as we were just saying there, Ollie, that people at the horse racing itself don't have, or bookmakers at the horse racing don't have to pay tax. So yes.
Okay. So, I mean, you can understand, Harriet, why people who work in the industry are upset about this. But from the government's perspective, and they've been kite flying all summer, haven't they? Shall we cut this? Shall we cut that? You know, compared to putting taxes on the things that people sort of don't have a choice about necessarily, like where they live, if they bought a house 20 years ago. This is a sort of luxury product, isn't it? Gambling. I mean, you know, you choose to gamble. If you choose to gamble, why not pay more tax? It doesn't seem that controversial.
I think that's ignoring the really interesting reason why online racing bets, the profits, that they pay a lower tax than the tax paid by online casinos and games. With online games and casinos, which pay the 21% tax rate on their profits, there's a guaranteed turnover. There's a guaranteed profit, which means that operators have a guaranteed percentage of the turnover. But the profits from betting are way less certain because it's a game of skill, right? If you bet on horse racing, you can study horse racing, you can study the bloodlines, you can weigh up all the different horses in the race and you make a bet. And if you are clever and if you know what you're talking about, you could make a profit off the bookies. So the lower rate of tax was basically to incentivize making that extra effort from the operators to kind of invest more. And that's the reason that there was this distinction, is that there is a distinction between a game of skill and a game of chance. The thing is that if you do put the taxes up, then the tax take actually goes down, according to some analysts, not up, because you push people towards the black market.
What does that mean? What's the black market in this circumstance? What would that look like?
So basically, like online betting on horse racing that is not legal, that is not regulated. And that is what is believed to have happened in the Netherlands when they pushed the taxes up on online betting in this kind of way. It's believed to have pushed a lot of people towards betting on the illicit market, which means that actually there wouldn't be any extra money from this anyway. So that's the argument that that the distinction exists for a very good reason, and also that increasing it to be in line would not actually generate more money for the Treasury.
But the thing is, though, Rebecca, does that ignore the fact that there's only kind of 4 or 5 really big players running a lot of these online casinos anyway? You know, I don't know what the parent groups are of all the different companies, so this might be the same company that I'm talking about now. But, you know, Ladbrokes, William Hill, Paddy Power, those kind of big brand names have associations with casino-style gambling products and with horse betting. So you'd think with a company of that size, they can sort of spread their tax take across their products, can't they, and make up the difference? Does it really, you know, who's going to be impoverished as a result of this?
Yeah, the betting companies themselves aren't necessarily going to take a huge hit. That's why, actually, I don't know if you saw this, but what was really interesting is that the strike has been framed as the horse racing industry trying to protect bookmakers' revenue and, by extension, the sport itself. But the Betting and Gaming Council, which represents bookmakers, reacted to the strike with what I would describe as barely concealed fury for a public statement. They said that futile political gestures will only antagonise the government and frustrate punters. They also said that the strike had been called without consultation with bookmakers themselves, and that's because this means so much more for the horse racing industry than it does for the bookies. I mean, we've been talking about how it will affect horse racing, but obviously if the levy is increased on betting on games of skill, that will affect all sports. But for most sports, this will be a relatively modest inconvenience. But horse racing and betting are just intrinsically linked in a way that, say, football betting isn't. You know, there are lots of money, of course, is spent betting on football, especially around the world. But people who don't gamble still watch football. They still buy season tickets and go to games. They still buy merchandise, funding the sport that way. Whereas most horse racing fans, I couldn't find any statistics, but most horse racing fans, I would assume, are also punters. Yeah, whether it's all the time or only occasionally. And so the fear is that if bookies are being taxed more, they will offer worse odds and fewer incentives on horse racing, which will make horse racing less attractive to gamblers. And so the worst case scenario is that both bookies and punters become less interested in horse racing, which harms the sport, not least because gambling contributes so much to horse racing. In the UK, bookmakers contributed £350 million to horse racing per year. In comparison, only 40 million for football. I mean, it's remarkable, the disparity. So horse racing really can't survive if bookmakers lose interest and decide that the effort of paying the additional tax rate and of having to calculate the odds and having to pay 10% of their profits towards this horse racing levy, if they decide that's not worth it anymore, that really is the end of it for horse racing.
Well, except, Jamie, I mean, we were hearing in that clip that you played us, you know, someone who works in a yard saying that she's finding it hard. But I mean, it's all underpinned by billionaires, isn't it? People who own racehorses have a lot of money. They also can pick up the slack. They also are going to do it not whether there's punters or not, but because they like it as a hobby and they like trading horses and owning horses.
I think what was interesting is the rise, particularly in horse racing, the rise in racing that it outwits the British Isles. It's the same arguments that we've had about the Gulf states being involved in other sports, and it's happening with horse racing now. You know, there are bigger and bigger races happening in the Gulf states with, you know, Saudi and other backers. So yes, that argument that you put across is potentially how ministers are going to dress it up if it does come to the budget. I think that's a question as to who picks up the bill when it comes to horse racing and how that changes. I also think, though, that the story is a bit of a snapshot of a broader shift in kind of how we view gambling in the UK. But over the last decade, kind of successive governments have tightened rules around gambling, limits on gambling advertising. We've actually had conversations on this podcast before about sponsorship of football teams and actions for kind of online betting for under 18s. It seems like gambling is being kind of treated less and less as a harmless pastime and more as a kind of public health issue. But obviously that's completely out of step with the racing industry, which is really pushing a kind of skill-based cultural institution. You know, you only have to look at the Grand National and the the kind of media around it as like the one time that everyone in the nation puts a bet on, gambling is like this fun thing, to realize that there probably is at some point, maybe this is the beginning of it, are going to be a divide between whether we say, no, gambling is actually a problem and is a public health issue, or is it a bit of fun that anyone can get involved in and actually kind of quite intrinsically British, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating, that question, I think, Harriet, because this concept of harmonising the gambling tax revenues comes from an article that Gordon Brown wrote, former Prime Minister, and a lot of the societal ills that we've been faced with in the last 20 years also have their roots in Gordon Brown in 2001 in his budget saying we can have fixed odds betting terminals in bookies on the high street. And I wonder, just from a sort of personal perspective, whether this is actually his guilt speaking. He allowed people to behave like they're in a casino when they're on the high street. Working class people lost hundreds of thousands of pounds as a result of that. And this is an attempt to say, oh no, there is a way to make it fair. That was the mistake, wasn't it? It's actually nothing to do with horse racing.
Yeah, the irony, I'm sure, is not lost on anyone, especially because, obviously gambling is a huge problem. The gambling addiction is it's a terrible ill and affects so many people in awful ways. But there is a much higher correlation between addiction and problem gambling and like casino gaming and slots, rather than, as we were talking about, games of skill like betting on horse racing. The correlation is significantly higher. So if there is a problem, it's certainly not the bigger problem in horse betting than it is in online casinos. I also think, and this is kind of weird for me to say as someone sitting here in London, having never been to a stable in my life, and kind of automatically knee-jerk thinking that horse racing is like really terribly cruel and outdated and bizarre, frankly. But it is true that it's really woven into the fabric of so much of the country. Like, in so much of the countryside, the horse racing or training facilities or stables are such an intrinsic part of communities, and they support the racing industry directly or indirectly supports 85,000 jobs in the UK. I don't have a stat to compare that with online gambling, but I think it would be a mistake to lump online gambling and casino and fixed odds betting in with horse racing and the kind of the physical and social infrastructure that is behind it. It's just not the same thing.
Jamie, this does seem like one, if I was a betting man, when the fun stop, that will make it into the budget. This feels like it's got the momentum. Yes, people are upset, but they're probably not the people that the Labour government are too worried about upsetting.
Yeah, and I think that the quote from the Treasury Minister, usually they say something about, we can't say before the budget, we're not going to comment previous to the budget. But this was actually him coming out and trying to mitigate it already by saying, like, look, you already get completely tax-free gambling. So I would agree with you in that sense. I think that probably is going to happen. I wonder, though, longer term, what that says, as Rebecca was pointing out, maybe potentially it wasn't the best idea in terms of a strike. It was very symbolic, and it did seem to kind of, it kind of took my eye to turn off all the racing and everything, but they haven't got any plans for further strikes. This seems to be like a one and done thing. And I think it probably will be something that ends up just kind of slightly fizzling out, that people say like, oh yeah, this was a bad idea. We weren't particularly a big fan of this. But actually it becomes part of the future.